Everybody, it is now 9:30 and time to start the finance meeting. So welcome everybody, welcome to colleagues both in the chamber and on Zoom, and our staff who are supporting council or supporting the finance committee today. Welcome to Roger, who's our lone public member in the chamber, as well as the many who are watching this online today. So let's start with apologies, and I have received apologies from Councillor Forsyth and potentially partial apologies from Councillor Wilson and McPherson, who have a 1:30 meeting this afternoon. Are there any further apologies?
Councillor Roberts, Mark here at Zoom there. Maybe a few minutes where I'm out of meeting between places. I'm at home on childminding duties for the morning, and then as soon as my partner comes home, I'll be whizzing in. So hopefully that'll coincide with lunchtime, but apologies if I miss a couple of sections of the meeting.
Thank you, Councillor Mark.
Hopefully we'll be back, but you'll be finished by then.
Thank you, Councillor O'Leary, for your optimism.
Mr. Chair, just clarifying, I believe Councillor McPherson and myself were on council business.
Yes.
1:30.
Thank you. All right, so I'll move apologies. Do I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Maxine. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Confirmation of the agenda, and the agenda run sheet has been distributed, and I will move that the agenda be in the order that it is on the run sheet. Do I have a seconder? Thanks, Councillor Ryan. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? Okay, there are none. Public forum, and we have today Roger Stratford, who's speaking on item 9, the Financial Strategy Monitoring Report. Welcome, Roger. You know the drill, 5 minutes, and with luck, we'll try and get the questions within that 5 minutes if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm speaking on the Financial Strategy Monitoring Report, in particular risks to the financial strategy. Good morning to those councillors I haven't met this morning. Expected rates revenue in 2021 by annual rate increase of 2.8% is adverse to balancing the books. I consider the council acted in good faith in limiting the services during the lockdown period. For that reason, there was no special need to amend the annual rates from 3.8% down to 2.8%. It's my belief that the public expectation is now for the annual rates to continue at 2.8% for the remaining years of the 10-year plan. And for that reason, this year's reduction has longer-term implications due to public expectation. Just considering the graphs, the debt to revenue and debt overall, the tables, to me, they indicate that there should be changes between when the books are expected to be balanced, which has been shifted now to 2023 to 2024. Just looking at the graphs, it appears to me that it's maybe 1 or 2 years later that there are some abrupt changes in the bar graphs, so that we've got just considering 2025 to 26 and 2026 to 2027, in those graphs there on the debt to revenue and so on, these bar graphs. I don't think that should be too much concern. I understand that the loss of debt resilience, which has been built up due to the national lockdown, the loss due to the national lockdown shows the importance of, to me, that shows the importance of retaining a 3-year electoral cycle rather than converting to a 4-year electoral cycle, which has been proposed, and which is, this council is submitted to the New Zealand, the national body for local bodies. And then in the recent council meeting, I believe that the unpredictability of capital portfolio rephasing and delay deferrals shows quite clearly that a 3-year cycle is preferable to a 4-year cycle. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Are there any questions? Thank you. Thanks, Roger. Appreciate you coming in and speaking to us. All right, we move on to item number 5, which is confirmation of the Finance Committee open minutes of the 11th of August 2020. I'll move those as a true and correct record. Thanks, Councillor Maxine. As a seconder, is there any discussion? No? Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Item number 6 is the Chair's report, and I will take that as read. And move it for that the Finance Committee receives the report. Any discussion on the report? Seconder, Maxine. Yep. Any discussion on the report? No. Sorry, I'm not looking in the right places. Sorry, sorry, Councillor Maxine.
Thanks, Chair. Just to the last paragraph of that, thank you to staff for the great work that's happening around the procurement review, and a sincere apology for the lack of time we were able to give at our most recent gathering around that. We were held up in a previous council meeting, and that did cut into that time. It's expected that we will reconvene soon and give due consideration to the report that Igor was bringing to us. So thank you to Tracy and Igor for their time. Kia ora.
Thanks, Maxine. Councillor Martin.
Underscore my thanks to Maxine, Ryan and Ewan for that very important work, and obviously looking forward to how that evolves. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Martin. Yeah, Councillor Maxine.
Thank you, Martin, and thanks for reminding me of the omission on there. Councillor Sarah Thompson is also a party to that group, as are you, Chair.
Okay, my apologies for leaving Councillor Sarah out. Wasn't intended, Sarah. Okay, so we've got a mover and a seconder. Those in favour that the...
Are you going from questions to speaking now?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes. So yes, please. We'll move. We have the motion on the table. We'll move to debate. Thank you, Councillor Ewan.
Thanks, Chair Rob. Look, I'm wearing a suit today to reflect the importance of the Finance Committee and some of the significant challenges we're facing as we go into the LTP. And I just want to remind this Council that we have some significant challenges leading into the LTP. I remind Council of my narrative that we really need to manage our debt to revenue scenarios, and we need to be mindful. I am continuing to be really uncomfortable with the fact that we're not balancing our books as quickly as I think we should have. And I truly believe this Council is on a wrong direction when it comes to its approach on growth, and I want to highlight those concerns. I look forward to the meaningful discussions that we will have as part of the LTP, but I'm taking this opportunity to reassert the concerns that I have, and I think they're shared by others, and I just want to highlight how important these issues will be as we go into the LTP.
Thank you, Councillor Ewan. Any further discussion, debate on the report? Councillor Dave.
Commenting on my friend Ewan's most recent comment, not the fact that he's wearing a suit, but the growth issue, I think we should note that both the government and the main opposition party, the National Party, have made it very clear that they think councils should be preparing for growth. I think in the National Party's case, they've specified 30 years, and it's actually very similar for Labor. Now, that doesn't mean growth necessarily into greenfields areas, but it is growth nevertheless, and there's evidence from this council that some types of growth in infill areas are even more expensive than growth in greenfield areas. So, notwithstanding personal preferences here, I think we need to be mindful of the outside pressures on us, and that will reflect in our finances going forward as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dave. Any further debate? Yeah, Mayor Paula.
I wasn't going to contribute to that debate, but just to take a balanced position, I think both Councillor Ewan and Councillor Dave are correct. You know, there's a big balance to be had in the LTP. There will be growth, and you know, you can't be like King Canute and hold back the tide. If there's some growth coming, there's some growth coming. But we do need to be very mindful about how we do it, and it's about timing and transition. We've spoken about that. I want to just put on record thanks to David for the really good first workshop that we had around the financial principles, and there's a range of views around the table about debt to revenue, and there's a range of views about how fast and how hard and fast we go about balancing the debt, I suppose. So that's the beginning of the conversation. In that respect, Ewan's right, there's going to be a lot more conversation through the LTP. We are in an economic recession, as we're told. So things are going to be different than they were before COVID hit. And we are going to have to cut our coat according to our cloth while maintaining the right balance of future investment to build an economy going forward and not to lumber future generations with problems. So it's actually very nuanced and very complex. But look forward to look forward to the debate and conversation about it. I think it'll be a good one, and I think it's one that the public will show much interest in. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion before I exercise my right of reply? None? Okay. All right. Well, look, I agree with Councillor Ewan that I'm looking forward, and I'm too looking forward to a meaningful debate, particularly on our financial strategy. We've started the journey to review the existing financial strategy and where that fits around the growth, particularly given that the world has changed in the last 3 years since we put together the last financial plan. I am, however, concerned about the culture of borrowing, and this morning's Herald, the central government are currently borrowing $128 million a day over and above their receipts from tax and other revenues. And, you know, it's easy to say this is the cheapest time to borrow. It's certainly the cheapest interest rates I've seen in my 60+ years of lifetime, and there may well be a strong case that now is the best time to borrow, given that the cost of borrowing is the lowest it's been for many, many generations. Sadly, when you borrow, it has to be paid back. And as Mayor Paula alluded to, I certainly don't want to be burdening future generations, grandchildren, great-grandchildren with debt, and debt particularly where it's been used not in intergenerational assets, but in terms of balancing our books. So we've got ahead of us a very full-on, sensible and meaningful debate around where we get the balls that are in the air, where they might land, and where we might get, and achieve the aspirations that are in those 5 strategies that we will bring to the table with the long-term plan. Right. So it's.
Yep, the motion is carried unanimously.
Thank you.
Good morning, Councillor Rob. Good morning, councillors. So, as Councillor Rob said, I'm here to present the first capital monitoring report for the current financial year. These are the results for the first 2 months of the year, July and August. While I will assume the report is read, I would like to make some comments in direct reference to the report. Firstly, and before talking to the current results, I would like to direct your attention to a document we've included in the report in attachment 3. This document's a looking back document from the 1920 portfolio results. It covers each of the 8 programs, and what it really does, I think, is it really reinforces some of the great work and some of the great deliverables that the city achieved during the 1920 year. So it's been presented in a very user-friendly format and a lot of graphics in there and a lot of little short snippets and a lot of pictures, but I think it's just a great reflection on some of the great work that we achieved last year through the capital program. So I would just like to promote that. In respect to the current financial year, as I said, these results are for the first 2 months. So the total portfolio for the current financial year is started at 302 million. 0.8 through the approved annual plan. It has now grown to 311.3 million, and if I refer you to the table on page 15 in paragraph 13, and you'll see there that we have a starting position of 302, and then you'll see we've broken down while we've moved to the 311 position. You'll see we had some final deferrals that we had to approve at the end of last financial year, and that was simply because we didn't have the time between the end of the year and the annual plan being adopted, so that accounts for that movement. We've also... Sorry?
Diligent, the page numbers don't...
Oh, are they?
Page 15.
Paragraph 13.
Paragraph
Oh, are
numbers.
they? Sorry, apologies.
That's all right, thank you. Just I was been a bit slow to catch up with you because of different pages.
Okay. So I've got paragraph 13.
That's it. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, so in paragraph, so if we start there, you'll see, that's all right, we're having fun. So we said there that we started the approved annual plan at 302.8 million, that's what the council approved. Subsequently, we have had 3 adjustments to that, and we're moving to a total revised capital program of 311.3. Those 3 changes so far have been the final deferrals from the previous financial year, so those are the ones that occurred in that last month between the annual plan being signed off that we weren't able to confirm. We've also, as a council, improved 1.6 million for the increase in the COVID contracts. And then we've got that last category, which is other at 2.9. The 2.9, I deliberately used the word other, maybe in reflection I shouldn't have. That was that other reflects solely to the Rotokauri Transport Hub, where we had to do a realignment of our budgets which was a housekeeping exercise to ensure that our budgets were in line with what we were going to spend this year. So there's no bottom line impact in terms of financial strategy, but it's just a realignment. That's what the 2.9 relates to. So, that's just a quick summary of the movement of where we are with the total portfolio budget. The actual spend after the first 2 months of the year sits at 32.7 million. As a comparative, that's well ahead of last year. Last year, at the same period of time, we were at 19.9 million. And so I think that just reflects that we do have that large program to deliver at 311. Last year we delivered a program of 190.8. This year again we're trying to deliver a program of 311.3. Given that this is only 2 months into the year, we're not currently reporting any potential deferrals for this financial year. That's simply because we want to wait till we've got more certainty around how the program is performing and how it's delivering. And as we know those deferrals, they will come back to future committee reports. What I can say, though, in the meantime, is we continue to actively monitor the program on a month-by-month basis, and any impact on this year and deliverability is being considered as part of the LTP considerations as well, ensuring that we're moving into next year in a consistent and aligned way. I should say that the program is large and it is complex, and we do have those third-party dependencies, so it would be reasonable to assume we will have some level of deferrals come during this financial year. Having said that, I would like to note that Council recently awarded the significant contracts in the Peacocks area, and if you have a look at those, the Peacock program in respect to the total capital program, it accounts for almost 1/4 of it. So the point I'm making there is there's almost 1/4 of your program that is actually just about, that is firmly committed through actual contracts. So that should give us some confidence in that area as well. As a segue, it just leads in a little bit. I know it comes up in previous meetings. I'd just like to make reference to Peacocks in respect to the HIF fair value, which you'll see comes through Tracy Musty's report, the financial monitoring report. The HIF fair value is effectively that's the benefit the council receives from the interest-free loan. So it's very much aligned. The cash flow is very much aligned to the drawdown that we make on those HIF applications. Those HIF applications and drawdowns happen quarterly. And as you're aware, we're probably a little bit behind the 8 ball in terms of Peacocks because of some of the land acquisition. But now that we have seen those two, the major contract being awarded, we would expect to see that program start to accelerate. So while you will see an impact on the P&L or what's the Statement of Comprehensive Revenue and Expenditure because of that HIF fair value entry, it really is, it's a timing entry that's created by the timing of those HIF drawdowns. So I've talked to Tracy just as recently this morning, and I'm going to have a look at reforecasting that to be a little bit more accurate in terms of how that comes through, so it's not distorting the bottom line for you and reflects what actually is happening. On paragraph 19, I've made reference to COVID. On paragraph 18, I make reference that, look, largely the COVID impacts have been accounted for in the previous financial year, but subsequently the country did go into a second lockdown. That affected Auckland more than the Waikato. The issue for us, however, was with Auckland being at level 3, there was some few issues with contractors leaving the Auckland region to come down to Hamilton, particularly on our wastewater treatment plant upgrade, which had some small impact on both the movement of the contractor or the labour and the materials. We're not aware of any financial impact of that yet, but I'm just making you aware of that's something that staff are working with the contractor just to ensure, but we're not aware as yet of any financial impact in respect to that, so that was just a note for your benefit. In respect to work in progress, which starts paragraph 20, again, we're reporting total WIP, work in progress, at 277.4 million. And then you'll see in paragraph 21, move down and give you some analysis about what makes that up. I think my advice to you would be that the focus needs to be on the 13.8 million, which is the third bullet point, projects completed in service but not yet capitalised. Those are the ones that staff are focusing on. Staff are working very hard at the moment to get capitalised. The other WIP in reality is legitimate. You've got to remember we're a large organisation spending significant capital program. So to have a WIP balance at that level is actually not unreasonable, and one might expect it given we've just reinforced a capital program this year of 300 million. But as I say, so staff are working through that at 13.8, and you'll notice that the majority of the program is current WIP. So while it's an issue to be focused on, it's not an issue of concern at this stage. The final point I would make is as you move through paragraphs 24, you will see we have listed given you a short synopsis of each of the projects we've listed in the program summaries that we have classified as orange being at risk. So these are the projects that are getting the most attention by staff, just to make sure that we're on top of those. So there's a short synopsis of each of those and what's covering them. You'll notice that most of them are, some of them are actually going to be embodied within reports either coming to meetings in the very near future, i.e. the Infrastructure Operations Committee in a couple of days. But other than that, that's what they are. That's just to tie back the orange projects that you'll see on attachment 2, which are program summaries, and give you a little bit of an understanding what's happening there and what staff are doing to ensure that they are being managed and being addressed. At that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions if you like.
Councillor Ryan.
Yeah, just a simple question. Thanks for your presentation. Projects not yet capitalised, is that just a delay in terms of the value appreciation before it gets added into our books, or what's the process here?
Yeah, so from an accounting perspective, the assets that have been capitalised or in use, they should be depreciated, so there should be an expense sitting on your statement of comprehensive revenue and expense. They haven't as yet. A lot of our assets that we build are significant, not just in value but in lifespan. they tend to be in the decades. So it's potentially having a small positive impact on your P&L because that expense isn't sitting there. But I wouldn't say it was of a concern at this point.
Yeah, so it's just a timing. Until
yeah, it is very much so.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Ewan.
Yeah, thanks, Chair Rob. Thanks for that presentation. My question is relating to page 15. Clearly, we're saying that the deferrals in the last financial, or the year that we're discussing, was 4.1 million on a spend of 190 million.
Just for clarity, that was the total deferrals from memory last year were 142 million. That this was just these were the wash-up deferrals from last financial year, Councillor Wilson.
Over a total planned spend of what then?
So we had, I'm doing this from memory, so last year we actually spent 190 or 191. We had intended to spend close to 300. That was the last financial year.
Right.
Yep.
So I'm glad you raised that, because this is, I was concerned the fact that reading the report I'd drawn the wrong conclusion. I hadn't understood that in fact the overall planned expenditure was over 300 million and we only spent 190 million.
Yep.
So the balance was deferrals.
Yes.
And I'm challenging, there's a former councillor who used to spend a lot of time on deferrals. I now begin to see his concern. So my question was, in light of the fact that our planned spend going into this year was 311 million, and we only spent 140 million when we had planned to spend 300 million last year, what plan do we have in place to ensure we perform better? And secondly, does that mean that the ratepayer were rated for the planned spend that we never actually executed?
Okay, so there's a few questions in there. The first point is, so the 311 is the current revised capital program for this year. Councillor Wilson, it started at 302 through the annual plan. That 302 already included the deferrals that Council had previously approved coming into the year. So the original LTP program for year 3, I think, was sat at about 228. So we are managing that and to ensure we're getting the right disclosures around that. To the deliverability, as I said to you, it is a large program, it is a complex program, it has a number of third-party dependencies on it. It would be reasonable to expect there will be some level of deferral, but staff, I can tell you, are very diligent, very motivated to ensure the deliverability of that program. That's the point I made with the Peacock contract, was that Peacock growth program accounts for about 74 million, so it's just under a quarter of that total program, so that should give us some confidence about that deliverability in terms of that. And certainly as things change and as we become aware of more information, we come back to you throughout the year through the 6-weekly finance committee cycle to make you aware of that. In terms of the rating situation, I might, rather than, I'd feel more comfortable if maybe David would like to comment on that.
I'd love to. In terms of the 3.8%, it has two functions, right? Funding everyday costs for everyday revenue, as well as creating surpluses to repay debt. So when we defer, you'll obviously know that there's less debt, therefore less interest. What that means is the 3.8 will contribute to creating surplus to repay debt, if you like, as opposed to funding that interest in a perfect world. So we haven't overrated the community, because the 3.8 is what we rely on to balance our books and to create a surplus to repay debt.
Thank you. Let me just work that through in my mind, your answer, but I think I understood it.
Happy to chat later.
Last question. Last question is, where was, in this report, so many figures was thrown around. Would it be helpful if, in fact, there was a graph that just reminded us what that entire plan spend was? I had to sort of, you added a number of new figures when I started asking questions. So,
sorry, yep.
Which is great, but where could have I found that on my own reading this report?
The adjustments I talked about in terms of...
the original figure, then the 228 million, then the 140 million. I'm sure you've got it there somewhere. Maybe I was just not picking it up. No, look, I think in fairness, if you were to go to attachment 1, I'm just trying to make sure. Yeah, if you go to attachment 1, sorry, my eyes are going on me, which is the capital portfolio report for the total portfolio. There's a line graph in the top right-hand corner in the right-hand section, and you'll see there the. Although it's difficult to, because there's no sum on that, but that's effectively showing you the profile between the approved budget and the forecast budget and the actuals. It's not quite answering your question, unfortunately, Councillor Wilson. It's certainly something that I can work through, and I can add an appendix to a future report, or to send through supplemental information to you if you would like. If the Chair would be happy to do that, I'd find that really helpful. Just a single point where I could look at that clearly.
Maybe, if I can make a suggestion, maybe paragraph 13 might start off with what was in the long-term plan to start with, and what we've brought through as being previously deferred. So you go back to the 220 million, which was the amount for this year in the long-term plan, and indicate that it's gone up to 302 as a result of bringing forward. I think, is that where you're kind of coming from? So exactly. It relates it back to the original long-term plan. Perfect. And what's been agreed, because we did agree, if you remember, in the annual plan to that deferral in capital spending, which of course some of which didn't happen because of the first COVID-19 lockdown.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So I'm really pleased to say that I've got that table back at my desk, which effectively presents the capital expenditure program in the same format as actually published in the annual plan. It just gives you the analysis. It basically gives you the analysis between the approved LTP and the approved deferrals and the approved changes to move you through to that 302. So I'm happy to distribute that if you would like.
Yeah, even if perhaps next time the table just gets recalibrated to show that, which gives us that starting point. Okay, that sounds, does that?
Perfect.
Yep.
Thank you.
Councillor Ewan. Councillor Angela.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Just a question for Lance on I'm on page 22, a diligent, just on the entry to the zoo in Waiwhakareke. Lance, it says here, detailed design has been completed and building consent application has been submitted. So does that mean the detailed design is done and dusted? When do elected members get to have a look at that?
Pretty soon, so we'll be bringing that to a briefing or workshop. I'm not sure which one. We've actually got quite an exciting little video too, which I could actually circulate that. I think I've sent it to Councillor Mark and Kesh, so I'll circulate that to all elected members.
Okay.
It's probably not... for those members who are here last term, it probably won't be a surprise, but I'll probably just refresh your memory on that. So the design is pretty much what you saw during the last term when we went through the annual plan, I think it was, and we had a briefing. I'm not sure if you were there, Councillor Angela, so... But,
last time I saw, I got to see some actual drawings.
Yeah. So it's pretty much in line with that. So we'll come back to you soon.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Angela. No further questions that I can see. I've got one question around the fair value calculation for Peacock. So it may be you or Tracy who might answer this question. My understanding from your explanation, Ian, is that the fair value is in fact a credit that shows in our financial statements that represents the interest-free component of the HIF loan. Is that?
In essence, it's the benefit that the council is required through accounting standard to disclose the benefit it's receiving from that interest-free loan.
Yeah. So is that constantly being recalculated, the benefit, given the changes? I know when we first got the HIF loan, there were figures that were put out into the public arena as to what the interest saving would be over the 10 years, but interest rates have dropped significantly since then. Are we recalibrating or recalculating that interest benefit as rates are changing? Market rates of interest are changing?
Yeah, most certainly, yes, we are.
Yeah, okay, thank you. All right, so bearing in mind that we are receiving this report and we will dive a little deeper into this report and Tracy's annual annual monitoring report when we get to report number 9, I will move that the Finance Committee receives this report. Have a seconder from Councillor Maxine. Is there any debate? Okay, so if I can have a show of hands. Sorry, a debate? No. Yeah, Councillor Deputy Mayor Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Look, I just really very briefly wanted to pick up on Councillor Wilson's point about the deferrals. And this council, we know that we always have significant deferrals, and I understand that there are often good reasons for this, such as relationships, arrangements with third parties. But there's also the fact that we do tend to budget, it seems to me, and there are in a way which means that there are a number of projects that we simply don't seem to have the capacity to do. And I did raise this during the annual plan discussions, where we managed to cut nearly $60 million out of the next year's this year's capital growth budget without too much pain, really, which did make me wonder about the way we are budgeting. And with the LTP, I would rather see a situation where we find a way where we don't bite off more than we can chew.
cheap, and we are a little bit more conservative in our funding. And if for some reason we do need to bring something forward a year, let's say we've suddenly got an NZTA subsidy coming through, then we do that on a case-by-case basis. It really goes to the earlier discussion around the Chair's report on our financial position. I think there is room to revise this approach. I have held the view for some time that we do actually have the ability to spread out our capital budget a little more than we are across the years, removing some of the pressure on us in terms of debt levels and servicing that debt. I understand the reason that we have all these projects in there, and some of that has to do with capturing DCs by actually having the projects budgeted. But with the LTP, I guess I'd just like to signal that I will intend to kind of focus a little bit more on whether the capital budgets we're setting year after year are realistic. Thanks.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Any further discussion and debate? There being none, I'll put the motion to the vote with show of hands, please. Those in favour? Those against?
The motion is carried unanimously.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to item number 8, which is the annual monitoring report to the 31st of August 2020. And welcome, Tracy.
Good morning, everyone. So what I'll do is I'll take this report as read. I'm not going to give my great presentation and tell you all of the numbers and things like that today. So I thought I'd do something slightly different and just sort of talk about a couple of themes that I know, one of them of which we've already talked about this morning, that will show up for the rest of the year just to make sure going forward we're kind of all on the same page. So one of them is around phasing and forecasting. So one of the things that you'll notice, there's a few comments in this month's report around a little bit of timing and as we just heard with the HIF fund around forecasting that quarterly. So we obviously getting the budget really late this year, it didn't allow a lot of time for my team to turn that around and phase it over the 12 months. So we are just looking at that and redoing some of that exercise at the moment. So what we're doing there is just trying to really look at when do we think we're going to spend the money. So when you are looking at these year-to-date variants, it kind of aligns up a little bit better. So the HIF fund is a great example of we've literally phased that and spread it over 12 months. We know we're only going to do it quarterly, so it makes more sense to put it in at that quarterly position. So that is one of the things that you'll notice is probably in this report where it looks like we're sort of ahead of budget or not quite meeting that budget, and that's why. So obviously for the first 2 months doesn't really make a lot of difference, but it will towards the end of the year. In saying that, we are obviously still forecasting to spend all of that money and do what we said we were going to do by the time we get to June. The other theme and a couple of things you'll notice with today's report as well is we talk a lot about, you'll see some extra expenses going in and like operating and maintenance, for example, and yet we've got the revenue for it as well. So I mentioned it last year a little bit, but just to take that into consideration when you are looking at some of these lines individually, there is a lot of offsets coming through with some subsidies that we get or revenue that we get to do pieces of work from that perspective as well. So that's just something else to take into consideration if you're looking at line by line kind of variances. You do have to look at it, I guess, as a whole picture in most cases. The other one that I just also wanted to talk about, again, kind of got brought up with interest rates and Ian's report. So one of the big numbers that we quite often see is in our gains and losses. So we talk about revaluation of interest rate swaps and things. As you're all aware, interest rates are declining quite a lot at the moment. So that number ends up looking quite large, and by the time we get to the end of the year, will be even bigger. So just a reminder around what that is and what we're doing with that. So we had a lot of our borrowings fixed when I came into this role 4 years ago. Over time, we've released a lot of that fixed rate. So you'll see in our report, we're as at August, we're 41% fixed. We've just paid off another 2 loans in September, so that number will go down. what we do every month as an accounting treatment is we have to take the valuation of all of those fixed rates and value that back to as if we had it on a floating rate today. Now, our fixed rates range between 5.11 and 3.2% with that money that's fixed. The interest rate that we're comparing that to at the moment is less than 1%. So again, it's never paid, it's not cash, it's not something we ever do something with as far as actually spending it, but it is something from an accounting treatment that we do have to take into consideration. So while we're doing good in the sense that we're not having as much fixed anymore, and so obviously that gets better and better as those swaps and hedges come off, the lower the interest rate goes, it kind of goes the other way. So we're sort of obviously in the middle of that at the moment and trying to have less fixed and release it onto floating. So you'll notice that our working capital number and that fixed rate, because of what the payments we've just done in September, the next time I come to Finance Committee, they'll be a little bit different and a little bit more positive. So just sort of thought I'd talk about that one because it, again, as we go through the year, that does become a bit of an uglier number, unfortunately. So I'll take the rest of the report as read and happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Tracy. Councillor Ryan.
Thanks, Chair. It's maybe slightly pedantic, Tracy, but on page 54, attachment 2,
yep.
Just at the bottom in your notes, where you've got, for example, vested assets, 882 favourable, but with the hyphen in front of it, it looks like it's negative 882k.
Oh.
And it's happened on a few of them, and it's sort of, you just got to double read it because it.
Yeah, I did exactly the same thing and told my staff they've done the whole report completely wrong. It's actually a dash instead of the credits or the because if it's a credit or if it's wrong, it's in brackets,
right.
But with the dash. So I did exactly the same thing. So given that you've just mentioned that today, I might go back and see if I can report that in a slightly better way, because I was a little bit mortified when I read a whole lot of what I thought credits coming through to myself. So thank you. I'll take that offline and we'll see if we can kind of present that in a slightly better way.
No worries.
Thanks, Councillor Ryan. Any other questions? Councillor Ewan.
Thanks, Chair Rob. Tracy, this may be a silly question, but be gentle.
Sure.
Now that this council, and I'm so pleased that it has decided to treat the endowment fund as I feel it should have always been treated, and that it, can you help me to understand, are we seeing any immediate effect of that endowment fund cash being made available for us if we choose to do a particular project? Where would I start seeing that flow through in any of the balancing of the books or our debt? Because
Yep, sure. So, so the one piece that I'm aware of is the sale of the buildings in Ward Street. And I'm going to say it's due September. So as soon as that payment for those buildings come through, it basically goes straight to our debt. So obviously the debt will come down, that debt number will come down, and obviously from a balancing the books perspective, that means that our interest essentially comes down next time I need to borrow more money. I obviously essentially need to borrow less.
So have you, if I could, Mr. Chair.
Can I help as well?
Yeah.
So Tracy's exactly right. The decision we made was for part of the long-term plan. So in terms of our debt to revenue, we would be addressing that in the 1st of July next year. In saying that, the money is available now through debt. So if you had an opportunity, you'll see that we've got significant debt headroom because of the capital deferrals. Right. So if you had an opportunity that came up, that money is available right now to put on the table in terms of asking or requiring council to make a decision, do they want to go ahead? Right. So you're not hindered right now to continue on your strategy.
Right. Thanks, David. That is helpful. So right now it's not reflected in the debt to revenue because we're only doing that as of July next year as part of the long-term plan. But in theory, if a proposal was brought forward, you're saying the immediate effect it would have is we would have to go out and borrow. So for the period And so just again, explain to me, we would have to do that anyway come
That's correct.
post-July.
That's
right?
correct. So what you would be doing is asking council to approve. Let's just say there's $10 million investment that you'd like to make. You would bring that to council, obviously, for a conversation. If council approved it, we would just borrow that money and invest. The difference in the long-term plan year, starting 1 July, will be the debt to revenue numbers will exclude the cash on hand. So if you remember in that workshop, it was about a 9% difference.
Right.
So you would see the debt to revenue excluding that 32 million, I think the number was. So it would be only showing available debt capacity outside of the municipal fund.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Ewan. I've got Councillor Mark and then Councillor Ryan.
All right, thank you, Judge. Thank you, Chair Rob. Tracy, yeah, bear with as well here. I'm trying to find the impact of the living wage on personnel costs, and I'm presuming professional costs as well, since we resolved the contractors as well. Are we seeing any change in figures there, or how's that rocking along with your budget?
No, so remember you made that decision as part of the annual plan, so we increased both of those budgets. So the cleaning and security contracts and then the personnel expenses. So the budget of both of those areas were increased by those amounts that you approved in the annual plan.
Okay. So how is that going? Are we on track? Because I think we heard, we heard the whole thing was going to cost us, what, 300K all up or something pretty marginal. Are we pretty much bang on that?
So those that were on minimum wage have been moved up to the wage amount that you agreed to as part of the annual plan.
Right, so I guess what I'm asking is, did we get our numbers right?
Oh, good question. Did we get our numbers right? As far as I'm aware, yes, no one has mentioned anything why it would be any different from what we'd calculated based, I guess with a little bit of those, to be fair, it does depend on, so a lot of them are casual employees, so when we would have calculated that number, it would have been on a certain set of data of employees, so if that was still who we have right now, then yes, it would still be the same.
Okay, that's good news. Okay, thank you, that's all I've got, Rob.
Thank you, Councillor Mark. Councillor Ryan.
Thanks, Chair. Just a clarity, thanks, Dave, I think you clarified before that this ring fencing and the impact on debt to revenue with the endowment will be as of the LTP next year. Correct. In terms of the reporting. Correct. Thank you. And also just the figure that I was given that was public at the Economic Development meeting was at 48,024,000. So these figures keep getting quoted around. I just want to make sure that we're on the same page.
Yeah, I'll go on.
So one of them's cash and one of them's property.
Correct. Two of them are property, but the total quantum ring fence should be 48,024,000.
Okay, I'll go and check that.
So the property's already purchased, so it exists. So what you're looking to do is ring fence the cash to invest in further property. So,
well, not just the cash, the quantum, because the properties can be borrowed against. So the total quantum is 48 million.
Yeah, yep. But so what I'm saying is that so you're right. You've got an amount of money. Let's just say it's 32 million or cash and then 2 properties. That amount of money will be available for you to reinvest. So the whole lot is ring fenced, but in terms of the debt to revenue, that talks about cash and money, and what we have in the current debt to revenue calculation is that cash has offset our debt, and what we're doing in the change is to take that cash and not include it in the debt number that we calculate our debt to revenue.
Okay. Thanks.
Councillor Dave.
Councillor Bunty raised an interesting point for me regarding the living wage increase expenses. With the government's announcement of the quicker than expected lift in the minimum wage to $20 an hour, I'm definitely not expecting an answer today, but could we get some information going forward, not even at a meeting necessarily, that shows the cost, the new cost difference of bringing in the living wage compared with the minimum wage? In other words, the increase, part of that increase would have had to have been paid because of the increased minimum wage. So the quantum total extra cost to us of the living wage may well, and I don't know, the figure
we can
be less.
We can update the numbers. So what you're saying is that I haven't read that. Are they bringing it forward? Are they?
Yeah, they announced that last week. Aren't you following the election campaign, Mr. Bryant?
I love politics, as you know.
You work for a political organisation.
Been a little busy with the LTP, but...
You mean you get enough once every 3 years? You don't want a second round?
Thanks. Councillor Dave, that's your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Look, I'm not seeing any other questions there. I've got a couple, and the first one follows on from Councillor Mark, I think, and that is on paragraph 21, where you've listed there the personnel and professional costs are both unfavourable after 2 months. Is that a timing issue, or is there a permanent under budgeting for both of those costs?
Both. Personnel, we still have the annual leave pre-COVID issue as well. So obviously that liability is still quite high.
So does that mean we're adding to it all the time?
Absolutely. However, we've just had 2 weeks of school holidays, and a lot of the staff are obviously away over the last 2 weeks. So come next time, hopefully that'll look a little bit more favourable. And obviously we're working really hard with our staff to try and take leave. We're working on the Christmas break and using those. But with an accrual, so obviously if we're not taking it, you're not seeing the offset. So we've got this really large balance that basically we just have to chip away at and try and release. So, yeah.
Okay, so there is a concerted management effort
Absolutely.
to go on that holiday pay accrual doesn't keep going up and up.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely, yes.
It's a wellbeing topic for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As well.
Okay, thank you. And my other question is around the interest rates and the swaps that you mentioned, Tracy, and that is, does it ever become beneficial for us? You know, you mentioned 5.1 as being the top rate that we're still locked into on some loans, and the current floating rate at 0.9 or less than 1%. Does it ever become beneficial for us? And then you said that we never ever pay the loan off ahead of time and incur the penalty for early repayment. Does it ever become beneficial at a particular point in time to consider paying the penalty for early repayment so that we can then reposition the loan on 0.9 instead of 5.1?
Andrew's smiling. How often have you had that question, Andrew?
I'm smiling because this is Andrew from the Lgfa who's about to do a presentation.
Well, maybe
next,
I should have asked him to
you
leave the room while I was asking that question.
Yeah, look, I mean, the whole reason why you fix, obviously, is to create that certainty with interest. And I mean, just like you do with your home and your mortgage and things like that, it's the same thing as what we're dealing with here. Who knew that the rates would go as low as they are? So one of the things we've actively been doing, as I mentioned, is releasing all of those swaps so that we've got more borrowings on that sort of floating rate. And again, we had our PwC Treasury call last week, and you know they're foreseeing the rates to carry on going lower and lower. So that's one of the things that we will be bringing back to you as part of the long-term plan is our investment and Treasury policy as far as what are those limits. And at the moment we obviously have a limit of what we want, a fixed amount of what we want to be fixed. And so again, it's just having another look at that and sort of in the current environment, is that where we happily want to stay. So that's a discussion that we'll have as part of that sort of long-term plan. So I guess we'd be having a completely different conversation if the floating rate was going completely the other way, and we'd obviously be benefiting from that, but we're not. So we sort of, I guess we have to just live with what decisions that were made quite a long time ago.
Is the answer then to my question is that if we did want to settle a 5.1% loan and replace it with a 0.9% of 1%, we would pay the full penalty, would we, for the difference between the two rates?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And the benefit is that we had certainty of rates.
Look, I understand all that. I'm
But
just
yeah,
kind of
basically,
looking
if I
at
had to pay it,
the financial effect as to whether or
you
not.
still have to pay it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I don't see any further questions, so I will move that the Finance Committee receives the annual monitoring report to the 31st of August 20. Have a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Ryan. Is there any debate? No debate. So we'll do this by a show of hands. Those in favour? Against?
So the motion is carried unanimously.
Thanks. Okay, so now we move on to the report that wraps the two earlier reports together, and that is the Financial Strategy Monitoring Report, which is our recommendation through to Council. And Tracy, you're staying in the hot seat for that one too.
Always. So this report just ties up, obviously, Ian's report and my report as far as any forecasting adjustments. So again, just going forward, related to that conversation you just had with Ian around tying a few of these things forward and being a little bit more specific so you can tie the two together. So we will just change that recommendation to make that a little bit more clearer in the next report. The only other thing I just wanted to mention, we were talking about the graphs and the debt to revenue and what we were looking at. So something that we will be bringing and we'll make a little change to for the next Finance Committee. At the moment, if you look at paragraph 23, you'll see that we've got the blue, the green graphs. So the blue is obviously what was in the original 10-year plan. Right now, we're calling it the forecast graph. So what that does is basically takes our annual plan that you have just signed off and then makes changes to that going forward on any of these forecasting adjustments that we're bringing to you at each of these committees. What I am going to do is include the actual annual plan graph that you would have seen when you signed off the annual plan as well. So you'll end up with 3 bars. So you can see what we did in 10-year plan. You can see what you signed off as part of the annual plan, but then you can also see obviously what we're forecasting. So what changes you're making now during these finance committees and the effect of that, and obviously this current year as well as the future years as well. So I just thought I'd mention that, and we'll change that up for this next reporting for the committee. Hopefully that just you can start seeing a little bit of a pattern around what happens and what the effects of decisions being made during the year has on that forecasting number in future years.
Thanks, Tracy. Just before we go to the questions, perhaps you could respond to Roger's earlier question or comment in his public forum presentation about the future of the 3.8 and the 2.8, that the graphs reflect 2.8 or 3.8 going forward?
Sure. So as part of the annual plan, we agreed that for this current year that we're in was a 2.8% increase, and then the rest of the years were kept at the 3.8. However, as we discussed during that time, the effect of that loss or the less revenue that we're receiving in does have an effect on the future years. So, and that is reflected in these graphs.
Okay. And so it is correct then that there's an opportunity if council decided to recover that going forward, we would do that in the next long-term plan.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll go through the question list. Councillor Ewan.
Thanks, Chair Rob. Tracy, so on page 73, taking what you said earlier and what David said earlier, we should start seeing the effect of the ring fencing of the endowment fund in those graphs?
No, so as we talked about, so those changes, so this is the financial, what we're reporting on this year, and I will do all the way through until June, is the financial strategy that was agreed at the last LTP. The discussions we're having with you at the moment is on the LTP that'll start on the 1st of July next year. So, and that changes essentially, if agreed by council, will change the financial strategy that we will then report against going forward for those next 3 years. So this won't change with regards to the conversation that we had in the briefing the other day until the 1st of July next year.
Right. Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Ewan. Councillor Angela.
Thank you. Just page 73. Was that the graph you were talking about, eh?
Yes.
Yeah. So on pages 76 and 77, the total of the 2021 down the bottom, although there isn't a total, should. That's where we look for that list, right, of changes?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you just, for ease of reading,
Subtitle it?
yeah,
Yeah, sure.
and maybe just, I find it quite hard sometimes just to think, oh God, which year are we in?
Sure,
'Cause
yeah,
of course
I'll
our
split it into the
financial
years.
years are a bit, yeah, if you can bold it or something, make it a different colour,
not a
be
problem.
easier. And then that, to follow the money on all of those who made those decisions, that's normally just in the body of the report, isn't it? Like you'll say,
Yeah, so if you look at the table, for
So-and-so
example, on
committee.
paragraph 21,
Yeah.
you'll see these refer back to what you would have seen in the capital monitoring report. So
Yeah.
that's how we need to, and again, that's why I mentioned we probably just need to tie that back a little
Yeah.
bit easier to
Yeah.
perhaps in my strategy report refer to the paragraphs
Yeah.
that you've seen in the monitoring,
Yeah.
so you're quite clear on
Yeah,
it.
no.
So yeah, we can do that.
that'd be better readability.
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
You. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Maxine.
Kia ora, thank you. Let's stick with page 73. It's a popular graphic.
Popular page today?
Yeah, it is a popular graphic. It shows the new Lgfa limit being at currently 300 and then dropping over subsequent years. Is there a requirement for council to formally adopt that rate at all?
No, however, again, same discussion. We have talked about that limit as part of our briefings for the next LTP. So that would be another decision that you would make at the next LTP as part of the whole overall strategy. So if you wanted to increase up to those limits, that is when your opportunity is to do so. But again, remembering the decision for this particular one was made at the last LTP, which is at that 230%.
Indeed. And so therefore the process or the point at which we review and change that is through the LTP process.
Absolutely, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, kia ora, thank you.
Councillor Dave.
Just again following that question about the effect of the 2.8% one-off increase, following Rob's question about whether we could restore the revenue during the LTP period from the original. Are we going to be given information during the LTP, because I don't think we need it today, but over what the scenario would be for a rates increase to restore it in 1 year or other spread over longer years?
Absolutely, yep. That's all part of what we will be modelling for you.
Thanks.
I'm not seeing any further questions on Zoom or around the chamber tables. We have a staff recommendation, which is on page 71. I'll move. Do I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Ewan. Call for any debate? Yes, Councillor Ewan.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. I'm very happy to second this motion. Despite my best endeavours, I haven't yet been able to show anything proving that we've made a significant strategy change recently. Possibly one of the most important strategic changes when it comes to our financial strategies in the last 5 years by moving towards rehydrating the endowment fund. And so I'm really looking forward to a day when the report starts showing that significant decision of this council, because basically it enables the endowment fund and the Economic Development Committee to look and strategise how we can spend up to $48 million in projects that will provide a commercial or above commercial return and start growing that endowment fund as it was always meant to be. So I'm really pleased that I'm a part of a council that's saying we're open for business, we've got a lot of innovation, we're looking for opportunities, and with Councillor Ryan chairing economic development, I'm excited at that prospect. So I just wanted to take that opportunity to highlight that again as probably one of the most important strategic changes when it comes to finance in the last 5 years.
Point and passion noted. Mayor Paula.
Thank you. Just a couple of things on that one. Thank you both Ryan and Ewan, who've been taking a lead, and particularly Ewan's been taking a lead in this endowment fund work. It's time for us to reconsider what intergenerational benefit looks like. And, you know, we know that there are considerable needs for the city. Hotel is one of them, but there are lots of other ways in which we can invest and get a better return on that money, as opposed to putting it up against rates. So I want to thank you for your work. I also look forward to seeing what comes from that, you know, what opportunities do arise when we can be a bit more flexible. Just noticing in the pages 76 onwards, and looking at the cost of delay, just want to put it on when you don't do something 1 year and you roll it over to the next and the next and the next. Even if you look at the line which founders is in, it becomes more expensive each year to not do something. So I think if we are serious in the LTP, we're going to have to look about deferrals and maintenance as well as investment, but we're also going to have to look at the cost of business when we don't do something. So that's all part of the fine balance, in my view, coming forward. But good report, thank you. I agree with Angela's comments around just that addition, because you know, trying to find a particular line item. So, but the graph is very useful. I think adding that additional information, I think, will be better, and that will give us a really accurate track of how we're going against the biggest numbers, which is the overall budget, of course. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor Paula. No further debate.
Oh, yeah, no.
Oh, sorry to wake you up.
Sorry, that wasn't very enthusiastic, was it? Look, I just wanted to support Councillor Wilson and Councillor Hamilton with this, and with, you know, with their comments, and just again share my frustration at the fight that Councillor Pascoe and I had last term to try and keep that going and keep Hamilton Property Limited going and keep the endowment fund for strategic. And we weren't alone in that, but we sort of tried to forge ahead with it. And I'm so frustrated for the both of you now and the new council. But I guess that's politics, isn't it? I just hope that it doesn't. It took 3 years of that fight to wind that back. And I hope it doesn't take this whole term to wind it forward again. You have my 100% support. So I just had to share that extra frustration again. But that's politics, isn't it? That's politics.
Thanks, Councillor Angela. You've fired up Councillor Martin now to... Councillor Martin.
Okay, look, I obviously, with regard to the property company, have an open mind, but it has to be proven to me it's going to be the good tool. The critical thing is how you use the endowment fund to promote, obviously, economic, social and environmental well-beings. Obviously, I get that. Clearly, I have an open mind, but making sure that you don't outsource a way of overseeing that fund to a bunch of directors unless you're crystal clear that that is going to be the better and most effective way forward. But I assure you, Mr Chair, I have a very open mind, as I always do.
Thank you, Councillor Martin. Councillor Sarah, and then Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. Inspired by Angela, also just want to note my support for the work on the endowment fund and looking for opportunities to do something innovative as a council, the potential to provide both a commercial return but something that benefits the community. And there's some exciting options that have been talked about, so I really do look forward to that work progressing. And I also wanted to, I guess, reflect on something that David said last week or the week before when we were talking about the financial strategy. And he said, how many times do we actually kind of go back and look at it and ask whether we are, making decisions that align with it? And the answer is probably not enough. And so I'm keen to look at how we can actually embed this further in our decision making, but also looking at this report, it focuses on some aspects of the financial strategy, but I wonder if actually there are some other aspects that could be highlighted or reported on as well in this report. So, yeah, I think that we're putting a lot of time and thought into making sure that we've got a robust framework for decision making. So it's important that we then have it at the forefront of our minds. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Sarah. Deputy Mayor Jeff.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Chair. Look, I just, I want to, oh God, my face has come up all big in front of me, it's terrible. I just want to I guess, comment that Councillor O'Leary brought up the Hamilton Properties thing. The endowment fund is not, in my view at all, necessarily tied to the property company at all. In fact, and Hamilton Properties would actually come at significant costs if you wanted to set something like that up. To my way of thinking, there's actually no reason why you can't operate the endowment fund perfectly adequately, perfectly well, without having to go through the process of setting up Hamilton Properties. So, the last council didn't want Hamilton Properties, and I don't really see that as an issue. We're now in a position where we can formulate a strategy for how to use the endowment fund without, in my view, needing a property company to do it for us. We can make the calls on what's best for the city in terms of moving the city forward. So, and I add my voice to others in congratulating Ewan for the passion that he brought to that debate about getting the endowment fund going again. Thanks.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. Any other speakers? Perhaps some final comments. Look, I agree with Councillor Jeff. I never ever thought that the endowment fund was solely linked to a property company. We have in the past used a property company, and in some instances, if I go back through the history of that, it worked very, very well. And there were others that were challenging, but then so do decisions that that councillors make on and around in terms of buying and selling property. But look, I'm as excited about the reinstatement of the endowment fund as others are around the table, and I think that there's lots of working opportunities here. I don't think we necessarily have to go out and borrow another $48 million worth of new borrowings to get it back on track again. There are some properties around the city that have already been purchased either in the past or during the last term, which are part of strategic purchases that will be useful not only to provide income and growth for the endowment fund, but also to promote the strategies around Mayor Paula's comments about a hotel and other necessary add-ons that the city needs to fit and promote the new 5 strategies that we've got. So, I think over the next few months, once we put the recommendation through council and it's been approved and it's on the table, there will be opportunities for us to find ways in which we can bring the fund back in and utilise existing properties as well as new opportunities that will come along from time to time.
Point of order, but for clarification, I feel that the Deputy Mayor and yourself have slightly misinterpreted my debate in terms of I was just using HPL as the name tag for the whole debate of the endowment fund. I'm certainly not advocating and didn't believe that that's what we need going forward. I actually agree with everything the Deputy Mayor said, but I just think these meetings are public records. So
yeah, point taken. Thank you, Councillor O'Leary. All right, if there's no further discussion, Jeff, your hand is still up.
Sorry, that's an old hand.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, so we will go now to the vote on the staff recommendation, paragraph 3 on page 71. Can I have the vote by way of a show of hands? Those in favour? Against?
The motion is carried unanimously.
Thank you. All right, we now move on to find my agenda. We now move on to item 10, which is the New Zealand Local Government Funding Agency 2020 report. Before I move on to that, thank Tracy and Ian for their reports this morning. Thank you. And we have a guest. We have Andrew Mitchie from... Sorry, Mickle, spelt wrong here, Mickle from Lgfa, and we also have David, who's our representative on Lgfa. So welcome, Andrew. Sorry.
Presentation on the screen's just coming.
Okay, all right. And you've got a presentation which I think we've got in the agenda. Is that the same presentation? No? Okay.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us again. I won't go through all these sort of slides. I thought I'd just give you a quick overview of the business, touch on the SOI outcomes, and then just a little bit on the impact of COVID-19 on the sector's financial performance. So on page 3, forward one more. Thank you. The key things are firstly the credit ratings of Lgfa. Just to reiterate that Lgfa has a AA+ credit rating from S&P and Fitch. And while I remember, congratulations on your new S&P credit rating. I saw that sort of came through, so that's a very good outcome for you. And that's been important this year, having AA+ credit rating, higher than any bank in New Zealand, because it has enabled Lgfa to access financing at a time when, certainly earlier this year, global financial markets were very challenging. We've done a record amount of lending to the sector in the past sort of couple of years. So in the 12 months to June 19, we did 2.4 billion. In the 12 months to June 20, we did 2.3 billion. And in fact, in the year to June 21, it's probably going to be something like 2.8 billion. So record lending. A lot of that is refinancing to the sector, but there's also about $1 billion of new money each year, which in the last few years has predominantly been the growth councils doing that sort of borrowing. But in the last year, it's certainly been more widespread amongst the provincials and rurals. You've seen a real change in sentiment where there's now a greater acceptance of councils need to get on and do some of the infrastructure that is required. The membership has continued to grow, so this year so far we've added another 3 councils in 2020, and we've got another couple looking to join. So we're now up to 70, so only 78 councils in New Zealand, so we expect in the next couple of years, I don't know if we get Chatham Islands, but the rest I think we will get. It's just some of those have very little debt or no debt, so there hasn't been such a motivation for them to join. We've had the Productivity Commission report came out at the end of last year, seems a long time ago now. There's been something like 15 inquiries into council rates since World War II, and none of them have led to any substantial change, and the productivity one is going to go in the same basket, where it's again identified a lot of the cost pressures that are increasing on the sector, but hasn't come up with a lot of solutions in terms of funding options for councils. And again, perhaps just to reiterate, the majority of councils in New Zealand don't have a financing problem. They have plenty of headroom that enables them to borrow more. The real challenge is the funding side, so that every time you build new infrastructure, you've got to fund depreciation, fund the operational expenses, and that has implication for rates. So that is the challenge, and of course the affordability of rates. There's been the progress on the 3 waters that DIA have been leading. We've done a lot of work and modelling on that, so it will be interesting to see where that sort of progresses to. So happy to talk more on that if you wanted any of our thoughts. In terms of new products, we've been doing a lot of work on green and social lending. So this has been a real global trend in recent years as to environmentally sustainable sort of lending. So this year we're going to be in a position to make green or sustainable loans to councils. Some councils are more advanced than others in terms of being able to sort of do that. And ultimately it will lead to Lgfa probably issuing green bonds to the investors. In New Zealand, it's probably, in terms of the investor base, there isn't so much demand because it's a small market, so investors tend to have to buy, you know, the higher quality issues like Lgfa and Housing New Zealand. But certainly when you go to Europe and there's a lot more choice about where you can sort of put your money, being able to do sort of green bonds will enable Lgfa to grow its investor base, so that is important. And lastly, there's been the changes to the foundation policies, and in particular the covenants, which there was a question on that, so I'll touch on that briefly. Maybe if we go to page 5, just the SOI outcomes. I won't go through the forward-looking SOIs because it's pretty standard and we're forecast to continue to be profitable going forward. But in terms of the SOI outcomes for the 12 months to June 2020, the profitability of Lgfa came out at 10.6 million. That was a little bit ahead of the SOI forecast, but in line with profitability over the last few financial years. That's good, but Lgfa's focus is not on growing its profits. So to the extent that we become more profitable, we do want to grow our capital base over time because that's, as lending grows, we want our capital base to grow. But as we become more profitable, unlike a bank, we will return any extra savings to the sector. So that's, yeah, so the focus isn't on trying to increase profits from where they are sort of currently. Our expenses were in line or just slightly below what was sort of forecast, so again that's good. Our lending to the sectors, as I've sort of touched on, was in excess of what was forecast. Our market share continues to be extremely high, so our target's over 75%. Why we don't have 100% is because Auckland do a lot of their financing in their own name. So Lgfa can only lend 40% of its sort of lending to Auckland. And so if we lent them 100%, we would breach that sort of 40% mark. So Auckland roughly do a third of their funding through Lgfa and 2/3 in their own name. And in fact, they've almost outgrown New Zealand. So, you know, a third of their financing is actually currently done in the European markets. Where we had two objectives that weren't sort of met. So one is we have a objective to meet with each of our council borrowers each year. We weren't able to do that because of the lockdown, so we just had a period of, while the country hasn't been on level 1, where we were not able to get out and sort of do that, but we'll catch up on that. And we did have a breach of the Treasury policy, so we lent one council, which was Bay of Plenty Regional Council. We can only lend a council 100 million or 33% of their borrowing in any 1 year. And we breached that because they had one loan that was a bit longer term that came in to the 12-month period, and that aggregated with their short-term loans. So when that happened, we just sort of fixed that. So nothing that's threatens or had any sort of financial implications. It was just when that happened, we just had to fix it. So that's the SOI objectives, but perhaps, you know, this year it has been an unusual year, and the biggest benefit of Lgfa is just the certainty of financing that it's been able to provide the sector. So certainly back in March, April, you know, global financial markets, when there was so much uncertainty, were just dislocated, and there were just no corporate bond issues sort of going on. But the one thing Lgfa did have was the support of the government. So the government did two things. Firstly, it extended the standby facility it provides Lgfa. So it was $1 billion, and it's now increased that to $1.5 billion, and that's a new 10-year sort of deal. We've never drawn down on that standby facility, but again, it's there if we need to access it. Then again, it gives us the ability to finance the sector. We currently have $1.3 billion of liquid assets, so that's again liquidity that we could use if we weren't able to issue bonds for any reason. But we also had the decision by the government that the Reserve Bank would purchase Lgfa bonds in the secondary market. So prior to that, they were only purchasing government bonds in the secondary market, and they added Lgfa sort of to that. So the Reserve Bank's actually purchased around $1.5 billion of Lgfa bonds in the secondary market. And that was really good for investor confidence. So when investors, the superannuation funds and the ACCs and New Zealand Supers saw that the government was going to buy Lgfa bonds, it meant that they were very confident that there was good liquidity in the market. It meant they also then suddenly rushed in to buy it. So in the middle of the crisis in April, Lgfa was able to do $1 billion bond issue to investors. A good chunk of those were overseas investors, but again, at a time when councils were had uncertainty about their own revenue, it meant that they could sort of borrow confidently, knowing that Lgfa was able to issue bonds in the secondary market, but also had good access to liquidity if that was required. So just to reiterate, there's no compulsion for councils to use sort of Lgfa, so they're still able to borrow from banks or issue bonds in their own name. But this year, I think, has demonstrated the value of Lgfa in providing certainty of financing to the sector. Page 7, I'll just touch on the impact of COVID. So back in March and April, Lgfa was working with DIA and Solgum LGNZ to try and work out the impact of COVID on the sector, and in particular council's revenue in the 2020-21 year. So that report, and that was important to us because, one, we wanted to make sure councils wouldn't breach their financial covenants, but we also were getting a lot of questions from institutional investors about what is the impact on the sector going to be. So we needed to be able to answer those questions. So the DIA report estimated that council revenue would fall between 2.3 and 11%. So in dollar terms, that's between $300 and $1.5 billion hit to revenue. That scenario was based on New Zealand remaining in level 2 right through to March 21. So the actual outcome's been better. So we've gone back to level 1 quicker than what was sort of forecast. So the likely outcome is going to be at the lower end of that forecast sort of range. And as you appreciate, the loss in revenue comes from a number of different sources. So rates income is probably the biggest, and that's largely because not that rates revenue went down in the majority of cases, but councils weren't able to deliver the rate increase that they were previously planning to adopt. Fee income, so again, metro councils certainly impacted more than the provincial councils. For some councils, lower investment income, and you certainly see it in the case of Christchurch, so lower dividends from their holding company, and a reduction in development contributions in some areas. So probably Queenstown would be, the council more affected than, say, a Hamilton or Auckland in that respect. And potentially lost fee income from NZTA. So there's still a little bit of uncertainty, but if road charges will be lower, and that's probably, again, going to come out on the better end of forecast given, road use is getting back to more normal levels, then is the government going to top up NZTA's lost revenue? Page 8. So what is the impact on annual plans? So I think all councils have adopted their annual plans now. So Napier were the last ones to do that. Nearly all councils went for a lower rate increase than what they were previously forecasting. A couple had a 0 rate increase, and there were even, I think, 2 or 3 that actually delivered a rate decrease. Surprisingly, more than half councils are forecasting a balanced budget outcome for 2021, and the actual average outcome for the 78 councils came out at 104%. So that's certainly a lot better than what we were thinking was going to be the case. For some councils, it's a little bit masked because there is some capital grants, one-off capital grants from the government via things like the provincial sort of growth fund that are actually making that outcome look a little bit better than its true underlying sort of position. There are a number of councils forecasting a operating deficit, and that's understandable given the economic environment and the desire to maintain rates at an affordable level given the economic sort of climate. So the challenge, I suppose, for the sector is going to be when they do their LTPs, given the economic environment is going to remain sort of challenging as some of the government subsidies run off and unemployment starts to rise, as to, what do they do then about delivering through the rate increases that are required to balance the budget. In most councils, I saw very few councils that opted to reduce their levels of service. So again, that's going to be something they have to think about going forward. Page 9, the very good thing that going into this year that existed was there was a fair amount of headroom that councils have under the financial covenants, and that meant that they had some flexibility in the decisions that they were able to make. And I guess that's always something important to think about going forward, is trying to keep a certain amount of headroom just as we go through this type of shock or an increase in extreme weather events, etc., so that you do have flexibility in the decisions that you can make. Just to touch on a couple of the sort of headrooms, so if we go back to 2013, the net interest to revenue, so in 2013 the net interest to revenue was about 7% for the average outcome, and it's now 3.5%. So interest costs are certainly a lot lower than what they were 7 years ago. And you had a slight discussion on sort of interest rates, but interest rates are now so low, so the ability for councils to service more debt has increased. And in fact, you know, next year there's a high likelihood that we're going to get negative interest rates, so it's entirely possible that you might be able to borrow short-term money and we pay you to borrow money. So
don't say
which will be an irony. So you might actually want to borrow more. Councils will benefit further as their interest rate hedges, and you talked about the cost of some of that sort of fixed rate debt. So as that sort of rolls off, you'll be able to replace it with lower cost debt. So again, the ability to service your debt is probably going to be one of the least of the challenges that you face. And even, you know, people focus a lot on the fact that council debt has gone up in recent years, and in total gross debt of the sector has been increasing, but revenue's also sort of been increasing. So if we look at net debt to revenue in 2013 for the average council, it was 111%. Today it's 68%. So, yep, you can stay on that one, okay, because I'm going to come to that next. So again, the headroom that councils actually had going into COVID was a lot better than maybe what sort of people thought was the case, and therefore, again, just to reiterate, councils had a bit of flexibility around the decisions they could sort of make in terms of their rate increase for 2021. And that view is reinforced by the number of upgrades that S&P and Fitch have done to council credit ratings over sort of recent years. So we've seen very few councils have their credit rating decreased. I think Christchurch were the last one that had a decrease in their credit rating. But there have been significant amount of councils that have had their credit rating upgraded. So now there's only one council that is A+, which is Horowhenua. Every other council is either AA- or AA or AA+. So given that the best bank in New Zealand is rated AA-, you know, pretty much every council is the same or better than the best bank in New Zealand. And the highest net debt to revenue outcome was 180%. So given, and the maximum councils could go to at June 19 was 250%. So that was capacity. So even they had 70% sort of headroom, which is good. And historically, a number of councils have had net debt to revenue over 200%. So even Hamilton, if you go back a number of years, had net debt to revenue of over 200%. So again, the fact that Hamilton's net debt to revenue was being able to sort of decrease now puts you in a better position to, gives you more options going forward as to what you can do. And the last one I'll touch on is page 10, is just the changes to the covenants. And we have got quite a complex matrix sort of here, and I'll just maybe touch on the reasons sort of why that is the case. So historically, the net debt to revenue was at a maximum of 250%, and going forward from 2026, that's going to be 280%. But we've got this increase in the next sort of few years, and then it drops back to sort of 280%. The reason for increasing the covenants is a couple of things. Firstly, compared to when Lgfa established, some of the growth councils have faced higher growth pressures than what was thought was going to be the case back in 2012. So, you know, your likes of the, in particular, I suppose, your Aucklands, Taurangas, Hamiltons, Queenstowns have had a lot greater population growth and pressure on opening up new greenfield sort of developments to cater for sort of growth and sort of housing. So that has meant we have wanted to provide those growth councils with a little bit more of an ability to cope with growth. Secondly, councils' ability to service their debt has, as I've touched on, has also sort of improved. So lower interest rates now mean just as mortgage holders can, you know, support more debt, so too can sort of councils or corporate borrowers for that fact. And thirdly, that S&P also changed their criteria to allow councils to have more debt for the quantitative outcome they assign to that sort of ratings band. So again, they increased the amount that councils can borrow without sort of penalising them. So while we've got this complicated scale, is because back in April when we were thinking about these things, it wasn't so much the COVID, it was just the potential that the government was going to offer co-investment opportunities to sort of councils. So we wanted to offer councils a bit more flexibility in the next year so they wouldn't be precluded from co-investing with the government if a good proposal came along for them. So it was just to provide a little bit more flexibility and also recognising that maybe revenue might be artificially lower, particularly in the June 21 year, than it might otherwise have been. So you don't want to penalise a council or cause a breach just because they've got this one-off reduction in their revenue, which is going to sort of bounce back. So that's the reason why we did that. But the key takeaway is that there's that extra 30% headroom that councils now have when they do their LTPs. So I'll perhaps finish there.
Thanks, Andrew. I've got some questions that have come up onto the board. Can you flick me back to Zoom so I can see if there's any questions there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so Councillor Hamilton.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for your presentation. You mentioned a couple of stats, the highest net debt to revenue outcome at 180.3, but was that the average across all of the councils?
That was just Kapiti's outcome, and okay. I think Auckland are not far behind that. So the average outcome, I can tell you. So the average outcome for a rated council was 69%, and for the councils that don't have a formal rating was 30%, so they're the smaller sort of rural councils.
And on the flip side, the growth councils have they're looking to have a much higher than average, obviously, net to debt and trending.
Yes, I think you have to remember, you know, one thing I would say is debt is not bad, you know, if you use it for the right things. So if you're using it for you know, growth infrastructure, and then, you know, that money is recovered over time through your sort of depreciation charge. Where debt can be bad is, you know, if you're borrowing for operating purposes on a long-term sustained basis. And an example of that is probably the council probably that are most guilty of that's probably Horowhenua. So they, if you look back the last 7 years, they have an operating deficit every year. And if you go back and add up all those years, then suddenly you accumulate quite a lot of debt that you've borrowed for operating purposes, and you still have your infrastructure renewals to do, and yet your debt levels have rise. So you sort of reduce your flexibility when you do things like that.
Yeah, sure. What's the general uptake been with the shift in the Lgfa rules on that debt capacity across councils New Zealand wide?
Sorry, can you say that again?
What's been the uptake or the response you've had across that shift in Lgfa lending?
So for the year ended June 2020, no council will exceed the 250% net debt to revenue. So in the near term, there's been no sort of response to that or uptake. Where there will be a response is when councils do their long-term planning. And it's more going to be, as I said, even Auckland, if you look at their net debt to revenues currently around 170%. So even they have some headroom to cope for the next sort of few years. So it's more when they think about where do we want to go over the next 10 years, they might decide to go up to 260, 270%, depending what sort of capex they have. But it also means, you know, I'm not recommending what you do one way or the other, you know, it's your choice. But, you know, previously your internal limit was 235, but it now gives you the option to maybe move to 250 and still keep some sort of headroom. So it gives you more options than what you had sort of previously.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Ryan. I've got Councillor Mark and then Mayor Paula and Councillor Thompson.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. Hey, just a couple of things that quite make sense to me there. You were talking about Horowhenua, how they were borrowing for operating expenses, etc. And yet earlier on you mentioned them as having one of the highest ratings of anybody. How does that work?
Horowhenua have the lowest rating of any council. Yeah. So they've got the... Yep, so they're actually, all the ratings are listed on page 24 of the presentation, so you can see. So there are the highest rating of a council under the S&P criteria, which is what you have as AA. And so they're all quite compressed when you think about global credit rating scales. You know, they go all the way from AAA down to, you know, D. So the fact is, if I give you an example, Kiwibank, for example, is rated single A. So even Horowhenua has a better credit rating at A+, one notch higher than Kiwibank. And Hamilton is AA-, so you're one notch higher than Horowhenua.
Oh, that fills me with joy. I grew up overseas, got degrees, but that's a whole new story.
Yeah.
And one question, one thing you did mention though was about the, you talked about an artificial low potentially on the horizon. Do you think there's an argument that says, look, we're actually in a bit of an artificial high at the moment because there's that much government money floating around the economy, giving us almost a false sense of confidence. Can you just comment on that briefly, please?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I think, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, the government has done a standard sort of response when you get an economic downturn is that is to have some sort of fiscal stimulus. So that's both, you know, to businesses and then the wage subsidies and things as well. The question is what happens when you take that away. And New Zealand's fortunate, I suppose, that it has had a very good starting position. So if you compared it to Greece or something where you had a very bad starting position, again, you don't have the same ability to do that sort of fiscal stimulus. But, you know, the question is what happens to things like unemployment, what happens to some of the small businesses when, you know, those subsidies run out, or even some of the rental subsidies that maybe private landlords have been given businesses when they stop, what happens?
Yeah. So the lesson in that for us, I guess, is to not sort of hear this as a credit card company offering you extra credit, bolstered by the confidence that's floating around there at the moment, because that might be a temporary thing.
That's right, and I suppose in terms of the balanced budget outcome, you know, there is the requirement under the Local Government Act to balance your budget, but you can adopt not to do that. And so for some councils, if say you're Bay of Plenty Regional Council and you're sitting on a couple of $100 million of financial assets and no net debt, then it entirely makes sense to have a lower rate increase because you can afford to sort of do that. So we're entirely comfortable with councils adopting lower rate increases for this current sort of financial year, given the certainties, given the sort of financial sort of difficulties or challenging environment. Yeah. So that makes sense. But the question is, you know, how long do you keep doing that?
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Mark. Mayor Paula.
Mark asked a couple of my questions in part. You mentioned that most of the councils have a balanced outcome. Are those, any of those the 4 big growth councils, or?
No, I don't think so. I've got the list, so I'm more than happy to pass that through to Tracy.
Thank you. That would be interesting to me, because, you know, just want to see when you're in this high growth scenario, whether it makes a difference to the ability to balance books, because of course everybody wants to balance the books, it's just when and how.
Yeah, and the metro councils are the ones that took the biggest hit to their revenue. So it's given that's the sort of case, and then it was always going to be more difficult for them to balance their budget in the current sort of financial year. Whereas if you go to the rural councils, they took almost no hit to their revenue. So again, they had a lot easier starting position.
Right.
So it's sort of that, I suppose the current year for a lot of councils, it's just those balancing act, putting in all those sort of factors and trying to get, you know, an outcome which is sort of reasonable for the community.
So with these amazing low interest rates, do you expect to see more councils increasing their debt, or do you expect them, because times are uncertain, with, you know, with some economists going, we're in a W recovery, some are saying, well, it won't be a complete W, it'll be a shallower dip, and others are saying we're not out of the woods yet, could see another V event. Not that I know much about this, not being economists, but I'm listening to them. So in respect to that, do you think the mood of local government, since you work abroad with many, is to hunker down, or to use this debt capacity and this low interest rate to push forward?
I think it depends on the sort of council. I mean, there's a few issues going on, and one is going to be the challenging nature to deliver some of the capex that's planned. And there's been a lot of government stimulus, probably particularly up in Northland is the area most identified, where there's been a lot of government sort of grants, either through, you know, the water reforms, through the provincial growth fund, and they're just not going to be in a position to spend it. So I think councils generally want to do more capex if they sort of can, but it's whether they're going to, there's actually the capacity in the sector to be able to do it is the big sort of question.
Yeah, so that's why I was wondering, would they start borrowing more because they can?
Yeah.
Because you're right, you mentioned the big one, which is Three Waters, right?
Yeah.
Waters reform could be humongously expensive.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting. I suppose we're going to go through the consultation period as what the council response is going to be. So whether some are going to say, if we're going to amalgamate, we'll try and not do much now, we'll just, you know, or there's certainly the government money to sort of get on and spend, providing you can bring something sort of forward from future sort of financial years. But it will be interesting to see the attitude within the sector.
Okay, thank you. One last question. We saw a number of years back, post Christchurch and other events, excuse me, the impacts on the insurance of the costs of local government New Zealand. Do you see any further impacts? I mean, this is an uncertain time too. Insurance companies are struggling along with any other financial organisation. Is there going to be any impact from increased insurance?
There will be. There's a few things, I suppose. One is that IAG in particular have sort of over half the sort of market share in the insurance sector, if we're talking about, you know, private sector insurance. So they've certainly pulled back from the Wellington market because of the earthquake risk, and they just want to reduce their own sort of potential exposure. So that is putting, I don't think it's so much the councils that are going to be affected, it's the private sector is going to be the most impacted. And secondly, it's the issues around sort of climate change and managed retreat, and what, again, a lot of those beachfront properties, or you're exposed to sort of landslides, is whether, you know, some of that private sector residents are able to get sort of insurance. So that is going to be an ongoing issue. It's probably not too bad at the moment, but over time, it absolutely will be. But in terms of councils being able to insure their assets, I don't think there's sort of too much of a problem at the moment. And if you couldn't insure one particular, say, wastewater treatment plant because of its location, then I guess, you just have to self-insure that. And the councils probably, have the ability to do that by and large.
Yeah, no, that's good. It was a key topic on the Policy Advisory Group of Local Government all through the last 2 years, and just the impact of the squeeze on global reinsurers too. And given that there's an endless stream of disasters in the United States right now, I just wondered. So, hey, thank you very much, by the way, for the report. It was very easy to read. Thank you.
The sector is lucky with its 60-40 arrangement with sort of government. So that is something that I guess the sector should absolutely try and maintain and not let go, because it does sort of mitigate risk for the sector.
Yeah, thank you so much.
But some of the earthquake insurance risk, if you go to a town like Wellington, then maybe the commercial sector, the rents can support some of the improvements in the earthquake standards that are required. But if you go to Opotiki, they're probably barely commercial, those buildings at the moment. So if you say suddenly you have to upgrade upgrade the strengthening of those buildings so they're compliant, or go to Wanganui where, so many of the shops are empty, it's a real issue. So exactly how that is sort of managed. I suppose like climate change, some of these issues really need a national response to tackle them.
Thank you.
Councillor Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I was interested in just hearing a little bit more about the green and social and sustainable lending framework. Could you talk a little bit more about that first?
Yep, that's probably a whole session on its own. It's quite involved, but what is happening globally is a lot of investors, there's more demand to be doing the right thing, I suppose. And you see it with the KiwiSaver funds here, that, the first thing you do is you exclude various things like landmines, maybe tobacco, even gambling. So, they're the easy things to do, just exclude some things that maybe investors would prefer not to have in their sort of portfolios. The second thing that's happened, though, is people want to make positive sort of change. So you're saying, well, given we've got money to invest, what can we do that, helps address issues like sort of climate change, but also your underlying investors are keen to also be doing the sort of right thing. So again, there's been the development over recent years of what's called a green bond market. So when you make a loan, it is going to assets that are largely green. So examples might be things like electric buses, cycleways might be. So a lot of the water infrastructure doesn't actually meet the green category. It comes under sustainable, so doing things that are sustainable. And Housing New Zealand have issued bonds which are called social bonds, so they doing things that will create social good with things like sort of housing. So again, there's this whole growth in the fixed interest markets where rather than just issue standard bonds, issuers issue bonds which are called green or social or sustainable, so that investors can invest in things that sort of meet some sort of good purpose. So we want to be, I suppose councils probably are a lot of the least of investors' concerns. They're more interested in things like mining companies, for example, if you're lending to BHP. So when it comes to, call it the naughty box or something, the council sector isn't really seen to be in that space. So again, we're probably not being asked the hard questions that maybe you'd be asking of a mining sort of company. But still, we have to be cognizant of all these big global themes that are going on And so when investors ask us questions, we want to be able to say exactly where the money we are lending to councils is going.
Yep.
So that's going to be pressure on councils to be able to identify of your 300 or 400 million of loans, what's that actually sort of financing. So we're going to be able, over time, need you to tell us, you know, so much of that is going into water, so much is going into roads, so much is going into buildings. But is it a sort of a green building, or is it not a green building? And so that sort of information are things that investors are going to want to know over time. So we're going to have to build up that sort of database, and we're going to need the councils to sort of help us do that. So sorry, that's going to mean more work for you.
Yeah, it does sound like a big topic. I've got quite a few questions, so maybe there's an opportunity to learn more at some stage. Just with the green bonds, I know Auckland Council was doing some work around green bonds at one stage. What potential benefits are there that come with doing that, and how has that work progressed?
Yeah, the interesting thing is there isn't a lot of pricing benefit, so you don't actually get any savings, or we wouldn't. Lgfa, if it issued a green bond in New Zealand, or Auckland Council, they've now done, I think, 2 green bonds, they actually don't get lower interest costs from sort of doing that. It's more probably the benefit is growing your investor base. So I don't think Lgfa would grow its New Zealand investor base, because all the banks and all the investors are already investing in Lgfa. But globally, there's probably, if we, when we market our bonds up in Europe or the United States, we'd probably find, if we issued a green bond, we could get a greater range of, or greater number of investors from the overseas sort of base to sort of participate. So that sort of will help the sector, given that debt will continue to sort of grow up, to increase. So if our debt's increasing the number of investors that are buying Lgfa bonds will help.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. And the last question was just around the new requirements around disclosure of climate risks and things. Is there anything that would be relevant in terms of Lgfa and councils?
Yep. So as I understand it, there's going to be requirements on councils to do a certain amount of sort of reporting, and there's also going to be requirements on financial institutions to do a certain amount of different sort of reporting, but still reporting on those sort of risks. So as I understand it, that's going to come in, I think it's the government's intention to introduce that sort of next year, so that will be phased in. We're already doing, if you look at our annual report, we're already doing a lot of reporting on a lot of these sort of issues. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think we have, the sort of global reporting standards on these things. But it's more work for everyone, but it's, it's just the way the world is going, and you just have to adapt to that.
Thank you. Councillor Ewan.
Thanks, Chair Rob. Thanks for your presentation. Talking about naughty boxes. In your opinion, when talking about councils who have to borrow just to cover their operating costs, how many years in a row do you think that's okay?
It depends. It depends on your starting position, and it depends on why you haven't sort of balanced your budget. So there can be some one-off reasons why a council might not have a balanced budget. So, for example, Kaikoura actually gave away a whole lot of money to its local hospital a few years ago. So as a result, they had, their balanced budget outcome might have been 70%. So, but that's a one-off, and it's understandable. So you don't want to focus too much on that, because I think Waikato did the same, gave away their investment fund. So,
so would
you really want to understand the reasons why. And you can understand those reasons why the phasing in the funding of depreciation has been one that some councils are still doing. But I think depreciation came in 1998, so it's now been 22 years. Yeah. So, Yeah.
So 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 5
So we're not
years?
too worried about it. I mean, at a personal level, you can say, is it good practice or not good practice? But in terms of LGFA, you know, we respect that is individual council's decision, and so we won't step in. But where it starts to threaten the financial covenants, then we will. So we actually have a borrower watch list. So of our 70 borrowers, we have a watch list of 10, and a report goes to the board on those 10 each year. So they're the ones most likely to breach the financial covenants, or they might have like Wanganui, for example, had a wastewater treatment plant that needed a lot of remediation. So we were just watching that sort of project and making sure that, you know, they were able to fix that without sort of...
Okay, thank you.
But in terms of Horowhenua, yeah, I mean, it's probably at a personal level, it's been going on too long. So I think they should do something about it. And our board will start to ask questions about it.
You've said a couple of times, thanks, Mr. Chair, you've said, I've only got 2 other questions. You've said a couple of times, you know, the COVID scenario, hit on revenue, you've got to be mindful of all of that. Surely you're not saying that there's not another end of the equation where you've had a hit on revenue. If you're a commercial business, one of the first things you'd do is look at your spending as well. So just because you've had a hit on revenue isn't some get out of free jail card that says, oh, we don't have to be worried about our spending appetite. You're not suggesting that, are you?
I think it depends on every individual business. So I think if you're talking about councils, then I think certainly not in the first year, it's something you don't have to look at. But if you think about Air New Zealand, then absolutely things are so severe, and you've got to look at what the next few years is going to be like. And for some companies, you have to adjust your expenses. So it just depends. Also depends on what your starting position is as to how much flexibility you have and what time frame you do things.
Right, my last question is the question of amalgamation. Surely 68 local authorities is just far too much. Shouldn't we be trying to amalgamate and get some efficiencies there across the whole nation?
Yeah. So
absolutely not. Let's debate it.
So LGFA doesn't have an official position on things like that. You know, we respect the rights of, you know, councils to make that decision. But I would say if water consolidation progresses, if you look at something like the Wairarapa, and if you take the water assets out and you've got 3 small councils, then given the amount of compliance that is now required under various reporting things and long-term plans and things, then it probably makes sense. But again, I think, like the government, is just going to leave it to those councils to make their own individual decisions on.
Are they, do you think? I mean, are we not seeing recently government sort of saying, you know, with the 3 waters and other examples, if you don't amalgamate, we will. But, you know, and this is the first taxi off the rank. They're identifying the exact point you've identified, that, you know, smaller regions like Waikato and Waipa, who are going to have this significant infrastructural spend, surely they should join the city and become a super city. Just asking.
So DIA, I went to a number of the water workshops. So DIA said that, you know, they had no agenda in terms of amalgamation. So that's not the driver of the water reforms. I don't know. And again, it's not LGFA's view that there should be more amalgamation, but I suspect that the government will just leave it to individual councils to make that decision.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ewan. Councillor Maxine.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for your very fulsome presentation and answering the questions from us today. I'm interested in your annual report where you talk about an increase to the basis points from 10 to 20, and that's allowed you to gain the confidence of the investor sector to bring additional funds into LGFA. I wonder if you could comment on the impact that it might have on council and on potentially our additional expense.
It won't have much in terms of impact on your interest expense because interest rates are falling. So the falls in interest rates will more than offset the increase in the 10-point margin. So why the increase was done is because there were proposals for banks in New Zealand by the Reserve Bank to increase their capital base, so they increase their capital adequacy ratio. So banks, the proposal was that they do that over the next 7 years, so that's going to force banks that are registered in New Zealand to hold substantially more capital than what they're currently holding. LGFA isn't regulated by the Reserve Bank, but we still issue bonds to investors. We're still rated by the rating agency, so investors will still compare our capital base against what banks are required to do. So we want to hold similar capital adequacy ratios as to what the major banks in New Zealand are going to be required to hold. So it's just, I guess that's a good thing. While it's not good that your margin's gone up by 10 basis points, it's a good thing that our equity or retained earnings will grow over time, because that reduces the risk to you and the other councils as a guarantor. So should a council default, then we have a much bigger capital base to deal with that. And it also means, again, the rating agencies are much more likely to keep our credit rating at AA+, which again provides more certainty of financing for you if we have a strong credit rating. So we just didn't want to be left behind versus what is going on in the wider financial markets. And it's also not just a New Zealand thing. This is a global thing where banks are going to have to hold more capital because of what happened way back in 2008 when banks were too thinly capitalised.
Thank you for that. And that you talked also about not being profit-driven, but that your intention was to return profits to the sector. I see you're offering a dividend. How else might you be able to return profits to the sector?
By reducing that margin over time. So it's increasing that margin is something we will probably have to do for the next few years just to grow our capital base. But all that extra profitability will be retained within the LGFA balance sheet. The second thing is that something we are thinking about, not in the short term but in the medium term, is we might offer a discount for councils that do green lending as an incentive for them to do green or sustainable lending through us. So we might pass it back through those means.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any further questions. So I've just got one final question, Andrew, and thank you for the presentation. And that follows on a little bit from Councillor Ewan, and that's the concern that LGFA might have on councils that have continuing operating deficits. Do you ever get alongside those councils as a bank manager might with a business that is financially struggling in that particular area, to perhaps give some advice on how they might move away from those continuing deficits? And here I'm kind of looking at a number of those councils may well be well below their headroom, so they're not creating a repayment risk. Certainly in the medium term anyway. But do you work closely with those councils to suggest ways that they might move away from the deficit?
So LGFA is not an advisor to the sector, so that is more the role, I suppose, of your PwCs and Bancorps and things.
Okay.
We're happy to share our own personal thoughts about either your outcomes or the outcomes of the sector. But if you were starting off, for example, with no debt, you could borrow 5% a year for operating purposes for 20 years and you'd still only have debt to revenue of 100% and heaps of headroom. So again, we would take, well, LGFA would take the view that we might not think that's good financial practice, but it's totally sustainable. But, you know, in 20, 30 years, you might have to do something about it, sort of addressing that. So it depends on the council. But if the amount of headroom you have under the sort of financial covenants isn't great, so if you say get up to sort of 200% debt to revenue, then I would suspect the board of LGFA would be asking some pretty hard questions, and we might be required to do things like write to the council and express our sort of view that, you know, we have some sort of concerns. And at some point, the board might decide not to lend to a council anymore. So if we felt that they were going to breach in the next few years, then just like a bank wouldn't lend to a company that was going to breach, you know, I suspect the board of LGFA wouldn't want to lend to that council either. But in the first instance, we'd try and work with the council and maybe comment on their long-term plan, for example, if we had some sort of concerns.
Does LGFA, and the second question is, does LGFA have any concerns, as we often read in the media, that, you know, a potential time bomb for local government is that we've got infrastructure that is ageing, and we have reluctance with some councils to actually borrow to renew or replace that infrastructure, and you know, there's a day of reckoning, potentially a day of reckoning when all of these problems will surface, and there will be huge demands for debt to fix those.
It's a very interesting sort of topic, and there's quite a few elements to that sort of question. But if you think about things like the water reforms, for example, you've got the LGNZ position, which says, you know, the council sector can do that, all the renewals, and meet the new regulatory standards by itself, so it doesn't need sort of consolidation. And that is true if you do it over, if you have a long period of time to do that over, absolutely it's sort of true. If you take the DIA position and they're talking about 30 billion of capex that may be required, if that's required in the next 10 years, then the council sector is not in a position to do it on its own. It's going to need, you know, to borrow a lot more than what's allowed under the LGFA covenants, and it's probably going to need some government sort of grants as well to sort of do that. So it all depends on, how long, you know, you have to manage these issues over. So I mean, the councils, and same with climate change, for example, the LGNZ numbers on a 1 metre rise in sea level was a cost to the council sector for its own infrastructure of around, you know, sort of $5 billion. But if that is spread over the next 80 years, given the council spend around $5.5 billion on capex each year, that is entirely manageable.
So just to conclude that, do you think that the sector has got enough? You mentioned that you're not, LGFA are not advisors, but do you think the sector's got enough expertise around it to give us the appropriate advice, to give the sector the appropriate advice so that these issues don't all happen at once or in a short period of time?
I think the number one problem for the sector is a funding issue, not a financing sort of issue. And I think in particular with the water reforms, a lot of those rural councils will absolutely struggle to meet the regulatory standards that are required. So it's not that they can't borrow the money, it's just that the rates affordability on their ratepayers will be, you know, something that, you know, they really sort of struggle with. And I think, you know, if you look at Scottish Water, for example, you know, I met with the CEO of Scottish sort of Water, and he said they did a study back in around 2000 on the amount of capex that was going to be required. And it was a pretty open study, but it ended up being 6 times greater than what they thought. So the more you keep looking, the more you keep finding. So I suspect a lot of those rural councils have a very poor understanding about the state of their infrastructure, and if even Wellington are struggling, Wellington should be at the forefront of having good knowledge of asset condition, and even what's happening there is surprising them. So, the answer is just how long does New Zealand as a country want to manage these issues over? And sort of, the need for cross-subsidisation. I think without that, certainly in terms of the waters, it's going to be very difficult to achieve, to meet the regulatory standards that are required. And if councils don't meet those standards, then I guess even if you might not want to amalgamate, the regulator will have the power to sort of intervene.
Yep. Thank you, and thank you for the discussion. Thank you for the questions. Thank you, and seconded by Councillor Serra. So we have a motion on the table, which is the staff recommendation in paragraph 3. Is there any debate? No debate. So we go to the vote. By show of hands, please. Those in favour? Against?
So the motion has passed unanimously.
Okay, so before we go for a break,
Last paper.
we've got the going into. Have we got another paper? Just that. Yeah, no, I was just suggesting that maybe we have a 15-minute break, and then we go into public excluded. Pardon? We're just about finished. Yeah, we have. I don't want to beat your record, Dave.
You have a long way to go. There's a 7-minute record.
So before we do adjourn for break, I'll move that we move into public excluded. Thank you. Those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Okay, so if we can come back at 12:10 for the public excluded part of the meeting. Thank you.